Hello, my name's Tim Malone and I'm a historian and a history teacher, and I'm going to present a series of lectures on American history. And this is the first one, and this is about history itself. And I'm kind of insistent on doing a lecture on history because it was my experience as a student of history that most history classes do not talk about history at any point. They just sort of start. And I find that to be kind of strange. I think that history teachers should explain what it is we're doing in history class. And this isn't just true of history classes that I've taken. I mean, again, as I'll mention throughout this lecture series, because I taught introductory American history classes, the survey class it's called, I was solicited by textbook publishers who would send me college-level introductory survey textbooks, 30 of them. And I've done some work with them on various topics to see how they handle certain things. And almost without exception, the textbooks don't spend any time talking about history in general, explaining what history is, the overarching structure of what it is they're going to do in their textbook. They don't. And I'm going to start this series of lectures with a lecture on history. Now, if you follow through on my subsequent lectures, you'll discover that what I'm trying to do to a large extent is to sensitize you to certain terms and concepts and events and people. In other words, I don't want you, my goal would be here today, I don't want you to ever hear the word or read the word history again without thinking, oh, that guy explained that to me once. We talked about that. I want to sensitize you to the word history because it's out there. Of course it is. As you'll find out as we go through these lectures, I'm a definitions guy. I think historians should define their terms. I exasperated my dissertation director at Northern Illinois University years ago, Dr. Al Young, may he rest in peace. He says, "Why are you always defining your terms?" Well, because I think that's necessary in history. And so we're going to start today with history. And I looked at several dictionary definitions of the word history. Word history. Number one, an account of what has happened. A narrative, a story. A story. History, an account of what has happened. Boy, that's generic, right? That's generic, very broad. But it's interesting they use the word story. I have peers of mine, history teachers and historians, who wouldn't like that idea at all of history as a story. Because, of course, most people think of story as made up, as fiction. I'm not so bothered by using the word story to describe history because I'm kind of convinced that human beings are, there's that book, The Storytelling Animal, that's human beings, that our mentality is storytelling. And I don't mind that description of what history is. Of course, with history, it has to be a true story. It has to be true. The facts have to be, to the degree possible, verified and verifiable. But still, that definition, an account of what has happened, don't like it. Number two definition, what has happened in the life or development of a people, a country, an institution. What has happened first is an account of what had happened. Second, three, all recorded events of the past. Now this one, of course, drives me crazy. Now according to definitions in a dictionary, theoretically, the way in which the word is used the most should be number one. The most common usage should be the number one definition. And it seems to me that this number three, all recorded events of the past, is the most common usage of the word, and that usage of the word drives me as a historian and a history teacher crazy. I hate this definition. All recorded events of the past? No. History is not the past. History, you don't put an equal sign between history and the past. Boy, but again, that horse has left the barn. I can't stop that usage where people say the history and they mean the past. History is not a synonym for the past. The fourth definition is the branch of knowledge that deals systematically with the past, a recording, analyzing, coordinating, and explaining of past events. Knowledge that deals systematically, key term there, with the past. The branch of knowledge that records, analyzes, coordinates, and explains past events. That's what I do. That's how I want you to think about history. That's how every time you hear the term now, you're going to say, how is that word being used? In an overgeneralized way where they equate it with the past? Or are they dealing with history as a branch of knowledge, an academic discipline, a systematic analysis of the past? So that's, I want to start there, definitionally, and get it, to make it clear how I define the term history. Now, I wrote my own definition of history, and here's what I came up with. The branch of knowledge and or academic discipline, or perhaps way of knowing, I kind of like that. History is a way of knowing, that records and interprets past human events. History creates systematic written accounts of past events that include philosophical explanation of their causes and consequences. Causes and consequences. History is about causes and consequences. History is a systematic written, and I gotta emphasize that, history is a written discipline. Historians write. It's a branch of literature. The ancient Greeks considered history to be a branch of literature, and I don't mind that. It's written. And history is philosophical in that history posits that events are caused. Events are caused in history. Now, you might say, well, duh. Well, no. There are philosophies that posit that it's useless for humans to attempt to come to ideas of causes of anything. I mean, I minored in philosophy as an undergraduate, and philosophy 101, your first day of philosophy class, you stumble out and you're like, you mean we don't really know anything? And it's the truth. We really don't know anything. And really, when you break it down, we don't know the causes of anything, really. That's a valid philosophical view, that it's the cause of it. Don't waste your time. historians make a leap of faith, right? Historians say, no, no. That event. Causation is not chaos to a historian. Now, I'm going to consider some other points about history as we go along here now. You can't change the past, but you can change history. There's a statement for you. You can't change the past, but you can change your interpretation of the past, because that's what history is. History is an analysis and interpretation of past events. And that interpretation can change and does change all the time. And to a historian, that's of course. But boy, does that ever cause trouble. And it's causing trouble right now, right? In the summer of 2021, the news is filled with efforts by state legislators and other groups to determine what's going to be taught in history class. Here's an article from the New York Times from 2014, 7 years ago, where James Grossman is talking about the new history wars, talking about the struggle over history in our schools. This is 7 years ago. Well, there's history wars always, because history is an interpretation of the past. And as events change in the present, the questions that historians ask about the past change. Because history is an examination of the past with questions that historians want answered about the present. History is about the present. And the questions we ask of the past change. As new information comes to the fore, as new forces are recognized in the shaping of history. Of course, the classic example is some years ago, 10 years ago, in the attic of a house in Ohio, right? Somebody discovered a packet of letters from Warren G. Harding, who is from Ohio, President of the United States. These were letters to his lover, to his mistress. Now, there'd always been rumors and claims that Harding was cheating on his wife, right? Well, now here, verifiable letters in Warren G. Harding's hand to his mistress proclaiming his love and devotion. And some of it was kind of racy from what I understand. And so it's like, that can happen. That rumor about Warren G. Harding is now historical fact. So our view of him is going to change. That happens. That's rather stark, right? But also, for example, last summer's Black Lives Matter movement and demonstrations, highlighting the role of race and racism, and boy, there's a couple of terms we're going to talk about several times in this series of lectures, heightening the awareness of the role that racism continues to play in the United States of America. That changes the questions that the past is set in stone, but our interpretations of the past constantly change. No kidding. I mean, to me, that, it doesn't bother me at all. But I'm a historian, and I understand how it works. Current events can change the questions that historians ask of the past, and thus change interpretations of the past. An example is how the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s, Martin Luther King culminates in the Civil Rights Act of '64 and the Voting Rights Act of '65, changed the way Reconstruction was interpreted. In other words, African Americans in the 1950s and 1960s marching and demonstrating for the United States to live up to its all men are created equal credo, right? To live up to its equal protection of the laws, 14th Amendment. That movement changed how historians looked at Reconstruction, the period after the Civil War. That sort of thing happens. It's natural in the discipline of history. So I'm going to give you some other points about history, and a lot of them are going to be from this book here, The Landscape of History, How Historians Map the Past by John Lewis Gaddis. Young history majors. And it's interesting how historians map the past. He compares historians to map makers. And it's a very interesting comparison, I think. The Landscape of History by Gaddis. And here's some of the things Gaddis has to say. Gaddis says, we know the future, only by the past we project onto it. History in this sense is all we have. Gaddis, indeed, when thought of this way, the past is the future. Now back in the 60s, right, I was alive in the 60s, you know, we would said to a statement like that, we would said, wow, heavy, man. You know, I don't know what the young kids say today when something's profound, but you know, we said, the past is the future? Well, think about it. We only know the future. We only have notions of tomorrow because we assume what? It's going to be a whole hell of a lot like today and yesterday. We project the past onto the future. And when you think about it, it's like, yeah, that's what we do. That's what we do. Now, of course, there could be an asteroid hurtling at Earth right now at 50,000 miles a second, 50,000. And with our name on it, right? And boy, tomorrow won't. Like yesterday. It's a very interesting way to think about how humans cope and the importance of history. Gaddis goes on and he says, history interprets the past for the purposes of the present with a view to managing the future. So all three of them are there. History interprets the past for the purposes of the present. I'm a historian, a minor league historian. I've written history. And again, you know, this might bother most academic historians are trying to solve problems in the present by studying the past. History interprets the past for the purposes of the present with a view to managing the future. Gaddis says, historians generalize, compress and distill the past in order to make it usable in the future. Whoa, I like this. I like this. Historians compress and distill the past. You know what distill means, right? You render something to its essence. You get rid of the superfluities, the impurities. Historians try to winnow the past down because, boy, the past is vast. I mean, you know, and evidence of the past is vast. There's all sorts of evidence about the past. Historians winnow through that stuff. They distill. They generalize. Historians generalize about the past. They interpret the past to make it usable in the future. And, I meant to bring a textbook here, but I mean, Gaddis's book serves as an example. I mean, look at this. This is what historians do. This is his study of history for young history students, and talk about compressed and distilled. This is what historians do. They take the past, centuries sometimes, decades, sometimes just a year, and they put it into usable form. They compress and distill the past. That requires judgment, right? That requires historians make judgments what to leave in and what to leave out. It's the nature of the discipline. Some other points about history. History should strive to be objective. Historical consciousness demands detachment from, or if you prefer, elevation above the landscape of the past. That's Gaddis again, making this metaphor with a map maker, right? The bird's eye view. Historians take the bird's eye view. They make a map of the past. Historians should strive to be objective. Now, objectivity in the last 50 years or so has taken quite a beating, I believe, in the idea that no one can be objective. Okay, I believe that. Everyone brings who they are, their past, their history of contemplation on subjects. Everyone brings that to their current thought processes. It's the effort. It's the attempt. As Arthur Schlesinger Jr. said, he died a couple of years ago, Arthur Schlesinger Jr. He was 101 years old or something. He was, for years, considered the dean of American historians. His breakthrough book was on Andrew Jackson in the era of Jackson. He wrote a book called The Imperial Presidency about Nixon. Arthur Schlesinger Jr., he has a quote that says, "The historian is committed to a doomed enterprise, the quest for an historians have to try. They have to try." Now, historians aren't the only ones that we want to attempt to be objective, right? I mean, we want judges to be objective. Journalists are supposed to be objective. We want policemen to be objective, right? The quest. And again, I kind of like that. I kind of like, that objectivity is a quest for something that's not obtainable. But it's the quest that's important. It's the effort to try to be objective. Some more points about history. History is real. It deals with reality. Now, philosophically, realism is the idea that of sense perception exist in their own right and are not dependent on a universal mind or spirit. In other words, this chair I'm sitting in is here. And if I leave, it's still here. It's not dependent upon my perception of it. It's not dependent on an omnipotent being out there in the cosmos somewhere. It has reality in its own right. Now, this is, I'd say, commonsensical, right? I mean, we all have to deal with reality in a certain way, right? Although, a huge percentage of people give priority to a spiritual view of life, right? No, history is real. It deals with reality. It's realism. Objects of our perception of our senses exist in their own right and are not dependent upon my perception of them. History immediately has a meaning, and we understand it in the same common sense way we understand the world around us. History is real. History is commonsensical, right? History is a description of what is understandable in past human events. What is real. Now, it's possible, of course, that realism is a false lead, but history, again, makes the assumption of reality. There's a reality out there. Things are real. And I made this point. Let me up this point. History generalizes about past human events. It maps the past. Now, you get a map. There's various kinds of maps. Again, to follow Gaddis's metaphor, how historians map the past. You have a highway map that has highways on it. You have a topographical map that has physical features on it. You have rivers and streams map. There's different types of maps. Well, there's different types of history. There's different types of maps that historians make of the past. Historians generalize, compress, and distill the past. We talked about that. And here's Vane again, the philosopher of history. History is a true novel. Like the novel, history sorts, simplifies, and organizes, fits a century onto a page of text. I like that idea, that historians sort and simplify and generalize and write down an account of a day, a decade, a century, and fit it onto a page of text. Again, let me illustrate. Compressed and distilled. That's what historians do. They generalize. Is usually the best. The simplest explanation is usually the best. The principle that in explaining a thing, no more assumptions should be made than are necessary. Named after William of Ockham, a Franciscan monk, an English scholastic philosopher who died in 1349. Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the best. Occam operates against conspiracy theories. And we'll come back to talk about conspiracy theories in history when we talk about the Salem witch trial, several lectures down the road here. Occam's razor. The simplest, historians operate by Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the best. Another point about history I like to make. All humans are historically curious. Therefore, so are you. Now I taught thousands of students, and I know, they're give me my 3 hours of credit and get me out of here. I hate history. And it's like, no, even those students are historically curious. It's innate. It's innate in human beings. We're curious about the past. For obvious reasons, right? In a Darwinian sense. About the past. And I used to say to my students, and I say, my fondest hope is that at some point this semester, right, I'll say something, or you'll read something in the text, or you'll read something in one of the handouts I give you, and despite yourself, you're going to say, that's interesting. That's interesting. Because you're programmed to find the past interesting. History is pure curiosity about the specific. What motivates the historian is it interesting? And boy, I can tell you that from my own experience. My own historical research, you research things that interest you. Now, I never finished my dissertation, never got my PhD, but I was around, I've been around history circles for a long time, and I'd have young historians come to me. And they'd say, boy, I want to get a PhD in history, but, wow, I don't know what to write my dissertation on. What should I write my dissertation on? Do you have any suggestions? And I just say to them, find something that interests you. The question is it interesting? Do you find it interesting? And the same thing's true of you listening to me now. The study of history involves 4 things. Citation, you have to tell the reader where you got your information. You have to produce what a professor of mine said, historians create a critical apparatus as they go along. That is, of course, the notes. The notes. That's where history, and here they are here for Gaddis's book, at the back. Most historians now use endnotes. 100 years ago, they used footnotes, right? I use the terms interchangeably, endnotes and footnotes, and I love endnotes. I love them, but I'm a historian. That's where history happens. That's where you tell the reader where you got your information, so they can go check up on you if they want. They can read the letters. They can read the accounts, right? They can read Karl Marx. And they can decide for themselves whether your take on that, whether your interpretation of it is correct. You create a critical apparatus as you go along. Citation, you cite your sources. Periodization, historians divide the past up into hunks, eras, right? The Renaissance, the Enlightenment, the American Revolutionary period, because, of course, we don't go along and then all of a sudden in the sky, the end of Reconstruction, the beginning of the industrialization of America. The periodization is done retroactively by historians in order to generalize and simplify and sort the past. It makes sense if you're trying to understand the past to periodize it. But understand that it's controversial, and periodization changes. A lot of times historians say, no, that's not right. That era should end here, and here's the reason. Again, it's not like at some point in around 1400, somebody woke up in northern Italy and said, oh, isn't it great to be alive during the Renaissance? The Renaissance was retroactively imposed on that era by historians. That Burckhardt, who did that 200 years later. Periodization. It's an artificial, slashing the timeline, but it's essential to what historians do. And then, of course, 3, causation. Historians deal in causation. And then 4, presentation. You don't do a historical study of something and then squirrel it away and hide it in your safety deposit box. Okay? History, the discipline of history, is about publicizing, publication, popularizing or attempting to popularize your findings. Presentation. Historians must present their histories to the public and to other historians. It's an essential part of the discipline. So, citation, periodization, causation, and presentation. Now, thinking like a historian, this is from the organization. And again, we've covered some of this, but I thought it was interesting. One, cause and effect, change and continuity. In other words, what stayed the same and what's changed. Using the past in the present. Turning points. Turning points. There's an important idea in history. Some events are more important than others. Some eras are more important than others. Some events change the course of history. Turning points. Now again, this is in the judgment of a historian or historians. And turning points are oftentimes reconsidered, reframed. They're applied usually retroactively, although I don't know. I mean, we're on the 20th anniversary of the attacks on 9/11, and immediately that was considered a turning point, that there are some events that immediately are granted turning point status. The attack of the Japanese on Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, obviously, right? Immediately a turning point. Is a key concept and a key turning point in human history, and yet, you know, that idea was designated after the fact, right? I mean, the Englishmen who built the first textile mills in England in the 1770s and 1780s, again, didn't wake up one morning and say, "Oh, it's great to be in the Industrial Revolution." So turning points. Very important consideration, but again, controversial. And then the fifth one is through their eyes. Again, this is fraught with difficulties, interpretive difficulties. But that's one of the things historians do. And I understand. I never did that too much in my history, but you know, it's an important consideration. How did people view the world around the time of Columbus, for example? So those are just kind of 5, thinking like a historian. And then finally, historical consciousness. Gaddis brought up the idea of historical consciousness. And so how does a historian think? Several generalizations seem to apply. Historians think the past is important. The past created the present and largely dictates the future. There are life lessons, survival lessons to be learned from the past. Now again you say, well, duh, well no, there's people who I'm convinced don't care about the past. They don't. Now you say, no, they're just saying that. I don't know. There's people who say the past is gone. I look into the future. No, historians, the past is important. Therefore, since it's important, it should be systematically studied for information that could be useful for making decisions about the present and the future. Because the past is important, it should be systematically and rigorously studied. 3, the historical system. Search out, record and preserve information about the past. Historians, that's one of their functions. Search out, record and preserve information about the past. analyze, coordinate, and explain the past, publish and educate your findings and your analysis of the past, cite your sources, be open and transparent. 4, historians believe in science and the progression of knowledge. Progress. Historians are progressives. They believe knowledge builds. They attempt to build knowledge. And then number 5, historians, how do they think? Objective, reasonable, logical, commonsensical. Not spiritual and not magical. Objective, reasonable, logical, and commonsensical. Another quote from Vane. History is knowing for the sake of it. It is identical with mere curiosity. History is identical with mere curiosity. I don't know about that. I think that might be a bit of an overstatement. But it's thought-provoking, isn't it? History is knowing for the sake of it. History is curiosity. I kind of like that idea. Here's a good one. Here's a good point about history. Direct experience of events isn't the best path towards understanding them. Whoa. What? Direct experience of events isn't necessarily the best path towards understanding them. That's from Gaddis. So in other words, you're involved in a minor traffic accident. What this says is that the police officer who comes and investigates the accident after the fact will come to know more about the accident than either of the drivers involved. True or false? True. And in fact, in a court of law, that police officer's account will be privileged over the account of the people who were there. Direct experience. So, because I get this all the time in class, students would say, well, I wasn't there. I don't know what happened. Well, okay. And another example is that if you immersed yourself in accounts of the Battle of Gettysburg, July 1st, 2nd, and 3rd of 1863 in Pennsylvania, in Gettysburg, some consider it the turning point of the Civil War. Here in 2021, if you immersed yourself in the Battle of Gettysburg and you read every account, you would know more about the Battle of Gettysburg than anybody who was there. Whoa. Now wait, we'll take a step back and say, now the visceral, human, emotional experience of being at that battle, you can't replicate that on a page of text. Oh, okay. And I'll give you that. But in many important ways, you'll come to know more about the Battle of Gettysburg than anybody who was there. For one thing, we now have accounts from both sides, right? We now know what both sides were thinking. We have hundreds of accounts from both sides. Now, direct experience of an event isn't necessarily the best way to understand them. As a historian, yes. Another point about history, that men do not learn very much from the lessons of history, is the most important lesson that history has to teach. Aldous Huxley. Well, yes. I mean, as I sit here yesterday or the day before, we withdrew from Afghanistan after 20 years, and that we stayed so long in that war after the Vietnam experience is men do not learn very much from the lessons of history is the most important lesson that history has to teach. True. So that's my lecture on history.